So let's dive right in. One of the things that I've been doing over the past year or so is asking people questions and listening to their answers. And recently I asked a subset of a group of people basically, the three basic things, the three ons for projects, on time, on budget, on scope. And I asked them which one of those was the most important to success, and just stop there with absolutely no other context. And as a rule, one would expect people to ask for more context, or at least without context to say it depends, something along those lines. Interestingly enough, every person I asked, with the exception of one, answered the question and came up with an answer and a rationale for that answer. Now, what is that? And why is that important? Well, basically what we then discover pretty much immediately is that everyone has some form of bias, some form of cognitive bias, and we'll explore some of those. So this stuff is actually important because, very frankly, it helps us frame how we think, how we interact with those around us, how we interpret information. So this isn't just academic stuff. It's pretty important to actually be able to apply that, whether you're in project management, whether you're a scrum master, whether or not you're actually interacting with groups of people. So cognitive bias, what is a cognitive bias? There we go. A cognitive bias really reflects just that, a pattern of behavior. So if I ask the question, what's important in a project, one of those three, pick one, are going to define project success, I'll get an answer. And that answer, outside of other forms of context or other forms of pressure, will create a pattern of behavior so that a person then acts differently. They interpret information differently. So cognitive biases really are structured around trying to come up or understand why people interpret information and why they act one way or another. I do want to state this pretty much up front. Cognitive biases are neither good nor bad. They just are. They're part of basic human psychology. So basically, if somebody told you way back when you were in university or in college not to take that psychology course or not to take that sociology course because it had nothing to do with building software, nothing to do with working on teams, they were wrong. So just FYI. Because our biases cause us to see the world differently, we tend to act based on those things. So it acts as a filter. Information in, we take that information, we process it, we begin to act differently. Neither good nor bad, but we act differently. Therefore, those of us who aren't part of that group or don't share that cognitive bias all need then to understand or have a mechanism to interpret that. So it's interesting. I would suggest that cognitive biases are generally more easily perceived by people outside, whether it's outside of a group or people that are observing you. They see it because it's not part of it. It's not part of our normal behavior, which then fades into the background. For those of you here in the States, you'll recognize an ad that talks about nose blindness, and it's for Febreze, I think it is, to actually get rid of smells in the room, and they talk about nose blindness. We tend to be blind to our own cognitive biases, and teams tend to be blind to their own cognitive biases. Even though they're neither good nor bad, some of this stuff sort of sounds a little bad on occasion, and maybe we would perceive some of these cognitive biases as perhaps bad. Is this stuff important? I would like to suggest that cognitive biases are important because they affect how we behave, how we interpret how other people behave, but basically because they're inescapable. They are a part of basic human nature. They're programmed into our DNA in some cases, because we make decisions about projects and work on a continuous basis. Project teams, if you've ever been involved in a project, whether it's agile or non-agile, doesn't matter, we're making decisions on a constant, almost continuous kind of basis. And because we're making those decisions, we're basing those on our own cognitive biases. We have different perspectives. So I heard it defined. I was listening to a conversation at a testing conference recently, and I heard somebody, in essence, describe cognitive biases when they were talking about the tester's gut. In essence, how they would interpret, or they would be able to perceive something as wrong, right or wrong, just by intuition. That's a cognitive bias. That, in essence, is framing and filtering information and making decisions. Shortcuts and sometimes shortcuts can create blind spots or patterns of behavior that might lose effectiveness over time. Let's all jump into our time machine, our Wayback Machine, and look at some cognitive biases. One of those cognitive biases, where do these things come from? Think about it. Once upon a time, we were walking through the veldt in Africa, and if you were doing that at the time, you would see the tall grasses move, and you would immediately perceive that as a threat. We would then run away because, very frankly, it could be a lion. That lion would eat you. And very frankly, the downside of being wrong and it not being a lion is that you got a little exercise and you ran away. If you were right and you didn't run away, you got eaten. And I would suggest that unless you were the lion, that was bad. That would be high up on the bad thing kind of day if you weren't the lion. Biases were developed as shortcuts that help us to perceive information. So because we use these things to perceive information, to make choices, they get built in. We all fall prey to a wide range of biases that affect our perceptions and impact direction. Project teams all have biases. We'd like to think we're unbiased. We'd like to ignore patterns. We'd like to think that they don't affect us. But in reality, all of us use these sort of shortcuts to frame and affect our own perception, change our behavior, inter people's behavior, and finally to motivate ourselves. So I would suggest that there are three macro categories of cognitive biases. And you can go and do a lot of research online, and you might have some arguments with these three categories. But in general, I think you would find that you could group most, if not all, of the cognitive biases into these categories. And we'll run through a number of these after we walk through the definitions pretty quickly here. Now, I do want to say that there are tons of cognitive biases. Some of them are really esoteric. Some of them are really couched in psychological mumbo jumbo. And my friends, this is a kind of a dear friend that reviewed this report for me. That's a PhD in organizational psychology, and they would get really cranky when I convinced them that they talk mumbo jumbo on occasion. But the three kinds, we start with a perception bias, how we perceived what is around